So take us to the conventions, because these were sort of raucous occasions,
Yes.
and it ended up essentially it did split the Democratic
Yes.
Party at the time. So
Yeah.
which occurred first, the Republican or the Democratic?
The Democratic Convention occurred first, and their first meeting was in Charleston, South Carolina. Now, what had happened in the 1850s is that there was a minority, but a growing minority of what were called fire eaters. That is to say, Southerners who believed that to protect slavery, the South had to get out of the Union, that the Union represented a danger, and especially the Republican Party and Free Soil represented a danger. And so these fire eaters at the Democratic Convention demanded that the West be opened up to basically slavery expansion. And in fact, 3 years earlier, the Supreme Court came down with the decision Dred Scott, which basically overruled the authority of Congress to prohibit slavery in new territories. You know, that was the meaning of Dred Scott and why why it was so controversial. And Stephen Douglas, who was the senator.
Now, can you go back to Dred Scott for a second? Because
Yeah.
he was a slave or a former slave, or who sued to become free. Is that right?
Yeah, he was a slave who had from Missouri, who had been he was owned by an army surgeon who had migrated first into Illinois, which was a free state, a free soil state, and then into the Wisconsin Territory, where slavery was not supposed to be permitted because of the Missouri Compromise of 1820. When he got back, now I'm a little unclear on the details. I think he was purchased by some abolitionists who wanted to kind of test this case. But anyway, he sued for his freedom. And the case worked its way up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court came down with a decision that said basically that Congress had no authority to ban slavery in any new territory. And Justice Roger Taney, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, said that the Negro has no rights that whites are bound to respect.
Right. Okay. Essentially, he was not able to even sue because he was property. He wasn't,
property. Right. And that caused a lot of dissension. Not only, it caused dissension. Certainly, abolitionists who wanted to get rid of slavery didn't like it, but it set up a danger of a precedent that if Congress cannot prohibit slavery anywhere in the new territories, that's going to run right up against a growing free soil sentiment. But there were other cases working their way in the courts that might have set a precedent for saying that no state anywhere could prohibit slavery. So, in other words, if a slave owner in Maryland, which was a slave state, wanted to move to Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania couldn't disallow it.
So what I hear
and that was the specter that, and this is where you get the interesting thing in the 1850s, is that it's anti-slavery forces in the North who are arguing that the North was under attack by this slave power.
All right, Chris. So I might be being overly cynical here, but I think that generally, historically, people have been moved primarily by self-interest and less by sort of grand humanitarian interests. So correct me if I'm wrong. I'd love to believe I'm wrong. But what I hear you telling me is that you've got this growing sense of a competition for the future of society in America between the slaveholding South and the free soilers up north. And I feel like I want to see this through an economic prism, and I see two different sort of economic models developing and competing for dominance. Is that wrong?
Well, I would disagree to some extent. No doubt the South had a very different economy than the North, but I think you can overstate that. After all, the South was deeply enmeshed in the commercial, industrial, agricultural network. I think there's been this false distinction between agricultural and industrial. The South, after all, was exporting huge amounts of cotton, which was by the 1850s the biggest crop. 2/3 of the cotton that was milled or fabricated came from the American South. And in fact, the Cotton South and the new lease on slavery that occurred in the 19th century was fueled by the industrialization process. So, yes, I mean, the South is enmeshed in this. The problem was, I think, that the South was committed to the institution of slavery, and slavery had a pervasive impact on all elements of Southern society. Mm-hmm. And increasingly, I think it starts in the 1840s with the Mexican War, but into the 1850s, the South is feeling the white South is feeling beleaguered.
Right. So they're feeling, how can we possibly survive without slavery? How can we continue to produce and export?
Well, they could produce. I mean, after all, in terms of agriculture, the North was outproducing the South. It had a much more diversified agriculture.
So was it just a cultural
well, it was
thing?
it was certainly among those who owned slaves. Okay, there was not only an economic interest; it was a whole mentality, a whole way of life. Mm-hmm. In fact, I think probably one of the best analysts of this is Eugene Genovese, who's one of the few good Marxist historians of the United States. And what he points out is, yes, slavery was certainly the basis of their society, but it permeated everything. I mean, the whole personal identity was wrapped up in this notion of not only owning slaves, but a very sharp and very rigid distinction between those who were free and those who were enslaved. And, of course, it was based on race, at least in American society.
So the end of slavery, is it exaggerating to say, represented potentially the end of their world as they knew it? I mean,
yes. And, of course, all kinds of notions about the nature of blacks, the nature of whites, and so forth were fostered by this caste system. Mm-hmm. And, for many Southern whites, this was in jeopardy. And it would be increasing, that sense of endangerment was escalating as long as they stayed in the Union. Now, of course, what are they going to do about it? Well, you got an increasing body of opinion that said the South must leave the Union. Well, of course, if the South leaves the Union, that's the end of the United States of America. Mm-hmm. And there were millions of Northerners who were not going to let that happen.
Right.
This is national disintegration.
Well, okay, we're jumping around a little bit, but I want to ask a question about that because why didn't the North just say, you know what, you want your country, take your country? Mm-hmm. Aside from the obvious moral reason to say, well, we're not going to allow slavery to exist on our doorstep like this, but I'm not sure that was behind it.
No,
right?
At the beginning of the war, in 1860-61, I think it's probably safe to say that most Northerners, or the majority of Northerners, were not in favor of abolishing slavery. Okay, there was a growing abolitionist group, and they were certainly very strong and influential in the Republican Party.
But so the United States at that point is a large country.
Yeah.
And even if it split, the segments would have been larger than some already existing countries. Right?
Here's the way I look at it, and I think this is the way people of that time, Unionists at the time, looked at it, and that is that secession, that is to say, the breakup of the nation. Okay. Every political community of whatever size has disputes. There are going to be divisions. Mm-hmm. Do we raise taxes, lower taxes? Do we put a budget item here or there? There's always going to be disputes. How can they be resolved in a democratic context? Well, there's a vote, there's elections, representatives make decisions, maybe they cut deals and so forth. But to sunder the nation, okay, means that there's going to be endless fragmentation. okay? And there would be, in North America, I don't think there would have been two nations. I think there probably would have been several. And who knows that they may be at odds with each other. And they're, if you look in the past, I mean, for the people who had a classical training, they'd look at ancient Greece. Ancient Greece was divided up into independent city-states, and oftentimes at war with each other, certainly unable to, would have been unable to fend off foreign manipulation and influence. Certainly there would have been dire economic consequences with the disintegration of and it would have been a failure of democracy. Because one of the things here, I mean, Lincoln and others at the time called republicanism an experiment. In other words, we don't know how the system is going to work. We don't have an aristocracy, titled nobility. We don't have an established church. We don't have a powerful monarch. What holds it together? The consent of the population. Okay, if the population falls out amongst themselves and the country disintegrates, what does it say about democratic rule?
I feel like, and again, we're jumping around, but currently, I feel like I have often wondered, the idea, the concept of a nation and nationhood requires this belief in the myth of cohesion, that there is something connecting all of us. When, of course, the majority of Americans and families in the country right now, if you trace them back, they weren't here during the time of the Civil War, I would say.
Yeah,
right? And we have an increasingly diverse population and it's always been that way to a certain extent in America. And so I wonder, if conservatives today aren't also sort of fighting to maintain this vision of a cohesive national unit, and they feel at threat from sort of liberalization and diversification of society, they feel like that would threaten this idea of cohesion. Am I completely off base? Does this at all connect to the Civil War and the ideas of the time?
Well, I'm not sure what the connection would be. I mean, what you got to debate today is over the proper role of the federal government. You get issues of questions about, should the federal government or should any level of government be, to what extent should it regulate economic affairs?
Let me try and connect it.
Yeah.
I think, and this may still be off base, but I'm thinking there is this increasing sense of urgency to fight for a conception of nationhood that they feel is under threat, and the belligerence with which they are willing to fight for and defend this conception is growing. And I'm wondering if there isn't any parallel to a certain extent to what was taking place pre-Civil War.
Well, no, I guess I don't see it.
That's comforting.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think what we're going through now is the kind of political divisions we saw post-Civil War, when the country was rapidly industrializing and where tremendous inequalities were opening up and there was a lot of, actually even more strife than there is today, or in the 1920s. I don't think we're facing the same situation as confronted the United States in the 1850s. In the 1850s, I think the divide was far, far wider and with really no reconciliation, either among the contending parties or through some, breakthrough of another, political coalition taking over. I think the two sides were just too far apart. I mean, how do you compromise with it?
Right.
I mean, the secessionists argued, and I think they were being actually quite rational on this, and that is if every new state came in was a free soil state, slavery is in danger. The basis of the Southern way of life, as they conceive it, that is in danger.
Yeah.
Okay?
They weren't being conspiratorial.
No, I don't think they were being conspiratorial. And abolitionists said, you're right.
Yeah.
We want new states coming in because if that happens, the spread of anti-slavery feeling, anti-slavery feeling would grow. The federal government could, for example, pass legislation shutting down the domestic slave trade, passing legislation that provided jury trials to runaway slaves. I mean, all of these things, all of which would call into question the institution of slavery.
So who ultimately ended up running for president coming out of the conventions?
Well, getting back to the convention, of course, the Democratic Party split. Stephen Douglas could not possibly allow a plank in the platform that would allow slavery to exist.
Stephen Douglas, Democrat.
Yeah, he was a Democrat because he would be killed. He would be discredited politically back in Illinois and other places in the North. But the fire eaters who were adamant. In fact, I think they wanted the Democratic Party to split up because that gave more conservative Southerners a hope that they could, if the Democratic Party remained dominant, that they would have, they could get, they could protect slavery. Okay. The secessionists wanted to split the Democratic Party because that tempted too many conservative Southern Unionists to stick with it. Okay, so the Democratic Party did split. Actually, about three ways. There was another group that emerged called the Constitutional Union Party that wanted to devise some sort of compromise that would allow slavery, draw an imaginary line throughout the West, this West Coast, and allow slavery south of that line and prohibit slavery north of that line. But the Republicans would never accept that. So the Democratic Party splits. Of course, the Republicans are on a roll. I mean, they had formed in 1854 in the wake of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which was a disaster for those who supported it. In 1856, their presidential candidate, John C. Fremont, did very well. He got about 30% of the popular vote. And the Republicans were making gains throughout most of the North. And then in 1860, they come up with Abraham Lincoln.
Right. And so you've got Abraham Lincoln, Stephen Douglas, and Jefferson Davis. Is that right?
No, not Jefferson Davis. No, he was still a Unionist. There was here. I got my my reference sheets here. John Bell was with the Constitutional Union Party. That was this party that wanted somehow to work out a compromise. And then John Breckinridge was a Southern Democrat. Okay.
Right.
Now, the Southern Democrats were hanging in there, but they wanted to see what the outcome of the election was. Well, the outcome of the election was that Lincoln won the presidency. Now, the
Democrats were running against each other, weren't they?
Yes. And this is a classic situation. You see this time and again. When one party is cohesive and united, the other party is fractured, divided. The United Party is probably going to win, and that's what happened with the Republicans. Lincoln got 59% of the electoral vote. He only got about 40% of the popular vote, but because of the way the Electoral College was structured, and the Republicans swept all of the North.
Right.
And they had,
which was quite a feat for the time.
It was quite a feat for the time. And this is, of course, feeding the secessionists who were saying, look, the North is against us. You've got, and in fact, they cited that if Lincoln wins the election, if the Republicans get in there, now is the time for the South to get out of the Union.
Now, to be clear, when Lincoln was elected in his first inaugural, I mean, he was really sort of apologetic to the South, wasn't he? And sort of
wasn't apologetic. What he did is that in his first inaugural speech, he was elected in November. He was inaugurated 4 months later back then, and made conciliatory statements, hoping to work it out. But that wasn't convincing, to the secessionists. And for good reason, because it's not just Lincoln they're afraid of. They're afraid of people like Thaddeus Stevens. Thaddeus Stevens was a very powerful Republican congressman from Pennsylvania who was a militant abolitionist. In fact, he believed in racial equality, which made him very, very radical. There was Charles Sumner, senator from Massachusetts, who was hated in the South because of his militant and often vitriolic denunciations of slavery. So when they're seeing Lincoln, okay, they see Lincoln as almost kind of a front man for these what they call black Jacobin abolitionists. Jacobins were the radicals of the French Revolution.
Yeah.
So
and at the time, I mean, Lincoln was, you might almost say, like the George W. Bush of the day, right? Like he wasn't taken very seriously as a politician. They thought that there were people behind him pulling the strings.
Well, not really. He was taken more seriously than that. Because if you look at, well, in fact, I brought the statement right after Lincoln's election and before his inauguration. That's when South Carolina was the first state to declare secession. And they noted that Lincoln had made statements, for example, when he was running for Senate in 1858, that the nation can no longer endure half slave, half free. So they thought of him as, as a dangerous character from their standpoint.
But now the historical record shows that Lincoln was sort of a flip-flopper on that issue. I mean, it depended on the audience he was talking to. And on the one hand, he'd be saying, well, no, we can't really endure this. And on the other hand, he was saying, I pose no threat to the slavery.
Well, what else was he going to say?
Well, so the question is where, now we lionize him as this, great humanitarian or whatever.
Well, he was.
Okay, well,
he was great. He was a smart politician.
Okay, I want to ask you this because, there are these competing views of history, right, and how history unfolds.
Historians.
Yes. And so is it led by great individual figures, visionary figures, or are those figures reactive forces to the mass movements pushing them in that direction from below?
Well, mass movements. It depends which mass movement you're talking about. When Lincoln gets sworn into office, I don't think he had any choice but to be he was walking on thin ice. There was a dangerous situation, in succession. 2, 4, 6, 7 states had announced secession before he was inaugurated. He had to worry about what Virginia was going to do, what Tennessee, what Kentucky, some of these Arkansas, what they were going to do. And he didn't want to split the North. Not everybody in the North was on board with either, using force against the South or, and certainly didn't support abolition. So he had to be very, very careful.
So he was a moderate. I mean, he wasn't a radical.
I think in the end, Lincoln wanted to. I think he believed that slavery ultimately had to be eradicated. Okay, hopefully by peaceful means, by moral suasion, and perhaps by legislation.
So do you think that was his end goal all along? And like you say, he was being politically pragmatic from the beginning when he was making these conciliatory remarks?
Right, and because he didn't want to galvanize the South. The South wasn't united on secession. He also entertained something of an illusion that the secession movement was done by a tiny political minority that had usurped power in the South, and that if he were moderate, conservative Southern Whigs would reassert themselves. Now, that turned out to be something of a myth, okay? But I think he believed that body of opinion existed. And not everybody in the North, I mean, you have to understand where Lincoln comes from. He's a native of Kentucky. He built his life and career in central Illinois, which was settled by a lot of Southerners. He knew he knew his people. He knew the political forces at work. And not everybody was on board with, certainly not on the abolition of slavery. I think if Lincoln had stated at the very beginning of his presidency that he wants to get rid of slavery, I think the South would have won out.